Right, Ben, we're going to begin with your presentation today.
Okay.
What is the subject of your presentation?
So today I'm going to be talking about teaching discourse intonation for business presentations. So I'm going to talk about 4 main points.
Okay, you've got 5 minutes to do that.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, sir. So I'm going to look at 4 points within teaching discourse intonation. First, I'm going to just cover what is intonation in general, different ways we can teach on intonation, problems that students have with intonation in business presentations or presentations in general, and using discoursal intonation to help attend to those problems.
Okay,
so very briefly, intonation, something which is very often avoided by teachers because I think they perceive it as being quite difficult to teach or difficult for students to get their ideas around.
Right.
I think that's not necessarily the case. At first instance it might be that, but I think by focusing on the right techniques, we can really help learners. Because with intonation, at the end of the day, you are just going up or down. It's a rise or fall, or high and low pitch. And the point of intonation is just on the tonic syllable within a tone unit, within a chunk of a sentence. Essentially where the prominence is where you've got the tonic syllable, also called the nucleus.
Yeah.
And at that point, you'll either go up or down.
Okay.
And that's all we're really looking at. So there are different ways we can approach that. We can approach that from a grammatical point of view, an attitudinal point of view, or a discoursal point of view. And that's Brazel and Underhill talk about those 3, but let's say Roach mentions accentual intonation as well, and Crystal breaks them into 6 categories. So there's no fixed agreement, but there are these different ways.
Okay.
There are problems with grammatical and attitudinal, which are something different we'll look at, not for this topic. So there are different ways we can teach intonation. I mean, Dalton and Seidelhofer in the book Pronunciation mention the problems of teaching intonation because it is so varied. Roach as well mentions that the things which are accurate are too trivial to spend any time on. Whereas Brazel and Underhill say discoursal intonation can be really, really helpful. And so that's why I'm going to focus on discoursal. It works, I think, particularly well in business presentations or presentations in general, because many times when students prepare presentations, they're just reciting something, like they're just reading what they've written, and it can sound quite flat, and it's very easy then for the learners or listeners to lose interest. So by focusing on key points within that, we can help raise learners' skills and keep listeners interested. So there are different methods we can use to help students with that. So the way I use it is to give students a text of a speech.
Okay.
And then we listen to the first sentence together. We have that first sentence on the board. We listen to that first sentence, and together we break it up into the tone units. Broken it once in the tone units, we look at the tonic syllable. Once the tonic syllable, we decide with listening, is the intonation going up or down? And through the analysis of this, we identify why something goes up and why something goes down. So with discoursal intonation, there are a couple of ways. We could either say it's either referring or proclaiming, or we could say that there's more to say, or we haven't finished a concept yet, or we have finished and it's going down. So by looking at a few key rules of discoursal intonation, we get those established. The students then look at the rest of the text. This is a completed version, breaking up the tone units.
Yeah.
And then once they've got the tone units, they identify where the tonic syllable is. Once they've got the tonic syllable, they then identify whether or not the intonation rises or falls using this idea about is it referring, is it proclaiming, or more focused on this, is there more to say or not more to say. They record themselves, and ideally they'll be able to do a little contrasting comparison about what they've talked about, contrasting comparison of having read this beforehand without the pronunciation work with what they've done afterwards, and hopefully they'll then see that they can be more engaging, more motivating, and some of those problems about a monotone approach are then reduced, if not taken away completely.
Right. Yeah.
Is that about 5? Do I have any more?
It's about 5. No, just under.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So but I find a really helpful approach, and students have certainly had some good results from that.
I see. Okay. Right. Well, thanks very much, Ben. A few points to talk about arising from what you just said. The first thing you said that first of all the students listen to the first sentence in this. What is acting as the model that they're hopefully raising their awareness from?
Okay, so ideally, in this case, for a teaching side of things, it will be either me having recorded myself previously, or ideally a colleague. I like to have a different voice to do it, so it's someone different. So I'll hear me enough during the session. But I mean, it could be done by actually taking, let's say, a political speech, a politician's speech, and then you could just do the initial part of that. So it is some kind of authentic model.
I see. Yeah. And you said that this is good for working on really sort of the intonation from two different angles: the proclaiming and referring side of things, and also the level of continuing or stopping things. In terms of the proclaiming and the referring, obviously there are slight differences between when you're giving a very marked referring or a marked proclaiming. Do you address that on this?
With this particular activity, no. This is, I think that would require a different activity. For this, it's focused mainly on identifying when you're finishing a point and when you've got more to say. There are some really good activities about marked, proclaiming and referring. Mark Hancock's pronunciation games has an excellent activity called Don't Tell Me, which is all about referring back and the rising intonation, and then proclaiming for a new bit of information. So I think I don't know if you know the activity, but really good, and it's quite enjoyable as well, and it's quite fun. So I'd say it could be used for that, but I don't use it for this particular activity because I think there's a different pedagogical aim for this particular one. Yeah.
Okay, now with this, I mean, it's taking a slightly analytical approach, and we're breaking up the sentences into the different tone units. We're identifying it, they're discussing it, working on it in quite an analytical kind of way. Do you see the benefits of going beyond that with this and looking at the different intonational components of a sentence, like and introducing the onset and this type of thing?
I think there could be possibility with stronger students. I think in many cases I use this as a much more practical kind of speech coaching technique, and I think maybe if I went into onset and termination and so on in a bit more detail, that might turn it a bit more into a linguistics lecture. Maybe the kind of things that we might cover on the dip TESOL, but maybe isn't necessary for maybe an intermediate business student. So I think there are pros and cons. I probably wouldn't with a normal cohort unless they really seem switched on about intonation.
Okay, you talk there about a normal cohort. Now, presumably with a business presentation, you are working with small groups. But can you say something about the sort of different problems that you might find learners will have with this, coming from different L1 backgrounds, and how you address that?
I mean, do you mean having, let's say, teaching a group of entirely Japanese students or a group of entirely Spanish?
Or do you mean a mixed multilingual class? Small cohort.
It is entirely different. You're right, and at least when you've got a group from the same L1, you can focus on commonalities. There are difficulties. It's about differentiation, I suppose, differentiating the technique, and in many cases, getting the students to compare and contrast where they think the tonic syllable is actually quite a good learning point for them, to help them raise awareness of different types of pronunciation or how different people will approach something. But as long as at the end, when we go through this together, as we go in the plenary feedback discussing why people might have it in a different place, but we end up with a similar model which they practice, then I think there's still that raise in quality of their intonation at the end. And so while they might be doing slightly different things, overall there's still a really high increase in their presentational skills.
Can you talk about a particular problem you had with an individual student and how you dealt with it?
I think the problem was with a Japanese student who really couldn't hear where the intonation was going up or down. And so in that section where we had the first couple of sentences where we analysed stuff together and she was listening, she just really couldn't hear. Was it up? Was it down? She was really lost. And so in a later class we tried something a bit different where she recorded herself, as I say, just speaking as she thought it was. Then we did the pronunciation work, and although she couldn't hear where the stress was going up or down, She applied the rules, the technical element to it, and again, this is what Brazil and Underhill were saying is something you could teach. She applied the rules, then recorded herself forcing this intonation, and then she was amazed at how much better she sounded, and how fluent she sounded as a result, and less kind of staccato. So that was an example of a really good opportunity for her to develop her presentation skills.
I see. Okay. Right. Okay then. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Our time is up.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Shall we move on to the next part of the exam?
Yes.